Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man.
Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong? Listen, bud, he's got radioactive blood. Can he swing from a thread? Take a look overhead. Hey there goes the Spider-Man. In the chill of night, at the scene of a crime, like a streak of light, he arrives just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Wealth and fame, he's ignored. Action is his reward to him. Life is a great big hang-up. Wherever there's a hang-up, you'll find the Spider-Man.
Spider-Man, created by Steve Ditko. There would not be a successful cinematic, worldwide successful version of Spider-Man in the 21st century if it wasn't for the most creative costume in comic book history, and that would be Ditko's Spider-Man design, which has become such a recognizable worldwide piece of graphic design, really. In fact, it really is the Mickey Mouse ears of Marvel Comics. Ditko's Spider-Man, when he did it between 1962 and 1965, was really the most successful single character at Marvel Comics by the mid-60s. And yet, at the peak of its early fame, Ditko literally walked away from the character. And yet, almost immediately, his Spider-Man was replaced by this version, by this artist, JOHN ROMITA, whose own version would become, over time, just as memorable and even more popularly successful than Ditko's Spider-Man. And it's been 55 years since the change was made, and we're still having the debate over who did Spider-Man greater, Steve Ditko or JOHN ROMITA. My name is Arlen Schumer. I did a book about comic book art in the 1960s, known as the Silver Age, as compared to the 1940s, the golden age of comics, when superheroes first started and comic books as a medium pretty much started. The book is devoted to the work of primarily these artists who I consider, the way we look back on the Renaissance masters 500 years ago, future art historians, I think we'll look back on these men as our great Renaissance masters. And on the title page, I tried to match each artist's signature to a quote that would kind of sum up maybe their point of view about their art and their comics. Ditko said, "I like drawing the kind of drawing done for comics. Each artist gets a double-page spread opening to their chapter, and behind my written introduction on the right, of course, I chose a portrait of one of their characters that would best represent the creator. That character on the left is the question but he's not really germane to our discussion, obviously, because the characters ghosted behind my type would be the two Ditko creations he did at Marvel Comics in the early 60s. Of course, we'll focus on Spider-Man and how much Steve Ditko's own personality and life was injected into the character himself, especially his alter ego, the teenage scientist, what we would call a geek or a nerd, Peter Parker. From the very first Spider-Man, that panel. The archetype of Parker as a timid, kind of geek nerd, of course, goes back to the original geek nerd, Clark Kent, who became Superman. And then, of course, at rival DC Comics, there was also a scientist, but he was your typical over 30s establishment, that would be Barry Allen, the Flash, police scientist. So, it starts, of course, with Ditko's Spider-Man costume and the innovations of the costume itself that he would create that would become indelible parts of the character. I mean, his almost diagrammatic style and thinking out how Spider-Man's web shooters would actually work are part of the character's great appeal. And it was not the only thing that Spider-Man projected. There is, of course, his belt, bat signal knockoff, the spider signal, as Ditko called it. And the graphic innovations that Ditko brought to Spider-Man went beyond the costume, the spider sense. And this alone is just a gorgeous graphic. And then you get the split face, the split mask. This was Ditko's answer to his collaborator, editor Stan Lee, who also wrote, of course, the dialogue to Ditko's stories that, again, in collaboration with Lee, but I believe these are Ditko's stories just like they're Kirby stories, but that's time for another discussion. But Lee wanted more of Spider-Man, and Ditko was showing us more of Peter Parker's life, and that's why there was so much reader identification with Parker. And his solution, Ditko's, was to do the split face. And it ended up being one of the greatest graphic trademarks, really, of any comic book character. Here's another nice graphic image of Spider-Sense in the dark. Ditko's use of blacks made Spider-Man at Marvel a very unique character because most superheroes were always shown in broad daylight. Even Batman by the 60s, this was way before Neil Adams and the whole Dark Knight era, was in daylight. But Ditko would do Spider-Man in the shadows, blending the black of his costume in with the black of the background. Maybe Ditko's greatest cover of Spider-Man is this one from 1965. I mean, even with the type, which you might think is obtrusive, it's still a brilliant design that pays homage to the early 20th century illustrator, 1920s, 30s, 40s, Coles Phillips, whose graphic trademark was blending his foreground color and shapes into his background to create these very graphic shapes that the reader's eye would visually connect by how the artist would place objects in front of or behind the subject matter. Look at this image, of course, coincidentally, with a spider net, which brings us back to Ditko's Spider-Man. His pinups of Spider-Man were graphic masterpieces all their own because of the way Ditko chose to delineate light and shadow. Keeping Spider-Man, I mean, look at that right arm. That is totally stylized anatomy, yet Ditko makes it work. You know, he was able to not only get the spider-like qualities of Spider-Man shown, but you know, this is from the very first Spider-Man when he first gets his powers. What distinguished Spider-Man from every DC Comics character that came before was as soon as he got his powers, it wasn't, oh, I'll go fight crime like every DC Comics character did. It was, oh, I'll go make money. I'll go on reality television years ahead of its time, which was basically their knockoff of the Ed Sullivan Show. And that leads to this comparison between what was happening over at establishment DC Comics. Look at the slicker artwork of Carmine Infantino and Murphy Anderson on the right versus the somewhat crude Ditko panel on the left. And yet, it's the cruder, rawer artwork of Ditko that makes Stan Lee's dialogue read as fresh as it did, because we were so used to reading the wooden Batman TV show like dialogue from the panel on the right. And then, of course, the tragedy of Spider-Man, the guilt that he felt. Now, as an archetype in comics, of course, Bruce Wayne felt unconsciously guilty when he saw his parents get killed, not consciously guilty. You know, that's why he swore his life to, you know, avenge his parents' deaths. But Spider-Man, on the other hand, feels the actual guilt. And that's why Lee's famous caption at the end, with great power, there must also come great responsibility. In this beautiful Ditko panel, the size of a postage stamp. But when you look at it large on your screens right now, to me, it's like a German expressionist painting. This feeling of loneliness, of solitude, of isolation that Ditko is able to inject in his Spider-Man is something that we had never seen before in a superhero, because the guilt that Ditko made Spider-Man feel on his shoulders, his feeling partially to blame for his Uncle Ben's death. That combined with the fact that he wasn't embraced like every DC Comics superhero as a friend of the people. He was a menace, a public menace from Spider-Man #1's splash page. I mean, this wasn't an imaginary tale like we would get in DC Comics. This was the actual truth that Peter Parker was experiencing. And Ditko's ability to make us feel what Parker was feeling at the shock of not being accepted by the very public he was fighting for drove him nuts, literally. And Ditko is able, in incredible close-ups like this, to get across the human being underneath that incredible Ditko full face mask of Spider-Man. That, and the fact, of course, that he was a teenager. Years before the generation gap in the 60s, Ditko was illustrating Lee's dialogue of feeling like teenagers felt. What do I do with my life? Over at DC Comics, all the superheroes' alter egos were the establishment. They were over 30. They were like Ray Palmer, research scientists. And of course, they all had their beautiful girlfriends. None of them were married, of course. But I mean, look at what Ditko had Peter Parker going through with Gwen Stacy, future significant character in the Romita oeuvre. What did I do to become #1 in your hate parade, Parker says. Even the 6-inch tall Adam got the girl. No, look at Parker. What a nebbishy character Ditko was able to get across versus the smug establishment over 30, Adam Strange, drawn by Infantino and Anderson. Adam Strange got the girl even though she was a dimension away. Whereas Parker was rejected by the love of his life, Betty Brant, who wanted a man who had a good, steady job, who came home each night to his pipe, his paper, and to me. Betty Brant wished she were a DC Comics heroine that got the guy. I mean, you look at advertising art of the time, early 1960s, and you see that these very same Madison Avenue stereotypes were what we were being given over at DC Comics. Again, Barry Allen and Iris West. I mean, there's the DC Comics always get the girl, but not over at Spider-Man. Ditko gave us images and stories that ended like this. Graphic images that are etched in our brain. And this idea that, you know, Spider-Man wanted to be a hero, but he was an anti-hero. Is that the price he must always pay for being Spider-Man? As written by Stan Lee. And yes, it did drive him mad. One of Ditko's greatest covers in a slew of great covers is this one. And there are two of his trademark villains that he created, the Vulture and Sandman. The Vulture was first to come back in issue 2. And then in issue 4, these are 1963 dates, we get the Sandman. Classic Ditko pose, Spider-Man coming at you. And there's another Sandman image. This image would become one of Ditko's most iconic images there from the original panel. Again, notice Ditko's anatomy. While it's stylized, it's also very accurate for the type of figure Spider-Man had to be to distort and contort himself in the positions Ditko would do. I mean, that figure on the left is just so trademark Ditko, and yet the anatomy itself is pretty accurate. It's stylized, but it all works because Ditko was a master at the character. Again, study the twisting, bending features of those legs, and yet note where Ditko places the muscles and the stress points and the torque of Spider-Man's torso, so that the weight of where he's holding onto his web. I mean, you know, we could sit and talk about these incredible individual panels, but this is why Spider-Man became so connected to his individual creator. I mean, you gotta love this. Yeah, it's classic butt shot, but once again, the subtlety of Ditko's anatomical marks, where he chooses to delineate a muscle to make that position that Spider-Man is in totally believable. Of course, the spider-like qualities, the arachnid, the hanging Spider-Man here on one of his greatest issues of all time, the very first Spider-Man annual, the extra-length story that gave Ditko an opportunity to give us full page, really mini posters. You got to remember, the companies didn't publish or print posters in those days. I mean, nowadays, you know, we're in a cornucopia of comic book collectibles. Thank you, Stan Lee, for that alliteration. But back then, these full page mini masterpieces by Ditko, highlighting all of the great villains he created. Mysterio on the left, we'll show a little more of him later. But yeah, I mean, you feel Spider-Man above the ground and below the sea. That same annual gave us pinup pages like the one on the left. Again, imitated by every artist since, but truly never really duplicated. And then the semi-autobiographical How Stan Lee and Steve Ditko Create Spider-Man. Again, I believe these are Ditko stories that Stan Lee writes the dialogue and captions to. One of the very few and rare pictures of Ditko in the early 60s in his New York office. And there he is drawn into the panel. You got to remember, for fans at the time, material like this was like manna from heaven. We love stuff like this, the behind the scenes of how our favorite comics and characters were created. But if you were a budding young artist, the time Ditko took in this story to show his process and how he drew. I mean, there were no art schools were teaching comics back then. There was no how to draw Marvel comics in 1964. That's why this stuff was so memorable and so cherished and so pored over. I don't know if Ditko and Lee and the other artists who did these things back then really ever understood how much we treated each of these panels like a holy grail. And I bet you many professional comic artists know exactly what I'm talking about if they're in the same age range as I am, seeing these incredible panels by Ditko for the first time. That image alone is, to me, iconic, and we'll talk about this image maybe later on. But speaking of iconic images, Ditko just kept upping the ante. By the end of 1965, he would produce perhaps the greatest trilogy in the history of comics. Our issues 31, 32, and 33 of Spider-Man coming at the end of 1965, beginning with this very moody, somber, interesting graphic cover. You know, Ditko's water was very, very unique. It had a real solid feel to it. But to make a literally long story short, Spider-Man finds himself buried underneath tons of machinery deep underground, and water is seeping through and threatening to flood and kill him. And at the same time, he has to deliver some kind of potion to Aunt May, who's dying in the hospital. And, he's got to get that serum. And Ditko, and again, Lee's dialoguing here, but Ditko, the storyteller, is taking us along with Spider-Man's struggle, which is really a struggle against oneself and one's strengths and weaknesses. So as you turn the page, the tension builds as Ditko increases the panel size and as the water relentlessly drips down. And again, Lee dialogue, but you go to turn the page. Yeah. And you get this. Perhaps Ditko's greatest Spider-Man page ever. It's, I think, the only full page interior illustration Ditko ever did of Spider-Man. But given how he built it up, really from 3 entire issues to get to this point, is considered by fans and aficionados one of the greatest highlights in comic book history itself. It's been reprinted multiple times, most recently in one of these incredible giant size, a size of the original art kind of things. Ditko is amazing. This cover, of course, is based on, how do you follow up the 1964 annual? Well, how about the 1965 annual? This happens to be the first comic I remember purchasing with a quarter when I was 7 years old in the summer of 65. And it was my introduction not only to Spider-Man, not only to Steve Ditko, but of course, Doctor Strange as well. What an issue to come on to Steve Ditko and Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. But the one issue that had them all that I found out later was every fan's wish fulfillment that Ditko's 2 great creations would be teamed up, and that Ditko would, of course, rise to the challenge and make this particular issue as epic as it promised. Ditko and Lee delivered. I mean, to have Spider-Man traipsing through the patented other dimensional worlds, the pre-psychedelic, I might add, worlds of Doctor Strange, was something that we drooled over every panel. And when they were actually together, we were able to see things that we had always hoped we would see. The final panel, beautiful in its sunsetty pinks and blues, and the hipster dialogue by Stan Lee, of course. After Spider-Man would leave the city, he would always return back to his home in Forest Hills. The Marvel characters didn't take place in other fictional cities. No, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, right here in New York. In fact, the very first mainstream New York media article on the rise and success of Marvel Comics was in the Village Voice, the pre-counterculture newspaper, in the spring of 65, writing about Spider-Man as the super-antihero in Forest Hills. And then in January 66, we would get this infamous article. I say infamous because though the title refers to what Marvel's success was based on, superheroes with super problems, this is the article, the first mainstream newspaper coverage of Marvel Comics. Herald Tribune was a major newspaper along with the New York Times back in those days. But it's the article that basically established Stan Lee as the sole creator of the Marvel Comics stories and characters, with the artists being kind of relegated to just drawing up Lee's creations. In fact, in 1974, he codified this concept when he put out the book Origins of Marvel Comics that had text introductions written by Lee, of course, that basically, stated for the record that he created all the characters and foundation stories of the Marvel Universe, that they literally came off of his typewriter, as indicated by JOHN ROMITA's cover painting. Yes, JOHN ROMITA. We're going to be talking about JOHN ROMITA very soon. But over the years, you can see how Stan Lee especially was felt very proprietary towards Spider-Man, that out of all the comics characters over the decades, it was Spider-Man that Lee felt most, quote, ownership of. This is only a few years before he passed in 2018. And how did Ditko feel about Stan Lee claiming he invented Spider-Man. Look at what Ditko does in 1999. On what factual grounds do some people talk, write, and claim? Some people that Spider-Man is a one-man creation. Look at Stan Lee's Spider-Man creation, according to Ditko. The name Spider-Man, a 1 or 2 page synopsis for the artist who must draw it up. See, dialogue must then be added, working from the artist's rough panel script is a, bit of a convoluted way of saying the artist was telling the story. And yeah, remember, Lee is also the editor of Marvel Comics. It's the editor's job to sometimes give story ideas or points, but that doesn't mean it's in the end their story. But you can see how Ditko feels about the difference between what an artist and storyteller brings to the table. Look at this letter printed in Newsweek in, I think, the year 2001, when the first Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire came out, or was that 2000, 2002? I think 2000 maybe. But you can see that Ditko wrote in to correct Newsweek that Spider-Man is a collaboration. See? And then out of nowhere, in 2015, literally 50 years after he left Marvel Comics and never told why, he writes an essay in his ongoing publications that he does with Robin Snyder. You can see up there. And without going too much into it, you can see, if you're interested to know why exactly Ditko left Marvel Comics, Spider-Man and Doctor Strange at the peak of their early popularity. You can see some of the clues and reasons why when you look at how, starting in late 64 and into 65, the merchandising of Kirby's and Ditko's creations at Marvel Comics began and went full bore throughout the rest of the 60s. There's the image that became the wall poster. Not sure who that kid is. I found that image, of course, on the internet. It was in 65. Ditko would leave in the fall of 65. The Marvel Comics characters started to get merchandised, licensed, branded into other mediums, like these paperback books, which you can see are just knockoffs of Ditko's own artwork. In fact, look at how this pose from Ditko's last Spider-Man story that he handed in November of 65. Somebody in the production department had to take it and turn it around and work on it for it to be the cover of Ditko's last issue, dated July of 66. But comics are dated 3 months in advance to encourage retailers to keep them out on the stands longer. So this would have come out in April or May of 1966. And then it was a shock to most of us reading comics at the time, because there was very little comics fandom. You had to be really in the know to get whatever comic fanzines there were at the time. But for most of us, the next issue of Spider-Man at first looked like a bit of a Ditko cover, but this would be the first issue drawn by JOHN ROMITA, shown here in a 1969 Marvel Comics in-house photograph, and described as our own web-spinning wonder. Now, where did Romita come from? Well, Atlas Comics was what Marvel was called in the 1950s. And it was in the mid-50s, 1955, that Atlas, which used to be called Timely Comics, which is what Marvel Comics originally started out as in the 40s, they owned Kirby and Simon's Captain America, who hadn't been published since 1949. But by 1955, a few publishers were making very tepid attempts to re-enter the superhero market. This is a year before DC Comics does The Flash by Carmine Infantino, which would signal the beginning of the Silver Age. But who drew this revamped version of Captain America's a Commie Smasher? Yeah, that would be JOHN ROMITA. I think you can see he got to sign his name at the bottom right below Captain America's foot there. You can see that Romita had, if you know Milton Caniff, that's the school that Romita comes out of. Ironic that by the 1970s, Romita would become such a standard look of Marvel Comics, particularly on Captain America. Anyway, they only did 3 issues of Captain America and they didn't sell well enough. But there's Romita again, bold signature. So in the early 60s, he winds up at DC Comics. Now, DC Comics had, along with its superheroes, Superman, Batman, and the Justice League of America, they also had a line of romance comics with titles like you see there. And it was from these romance comics that Roy Lichtenstein, after dabbling with comic strip characters like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, starting in 1962, would delve into these romance comics drawn by artists like Tony Tallarico and J. Scott Pike, and this story by Mike Sikowski, who would end up drawing Justice League of America. But what Lichtenstein would do was find a panel that appealed to him for whatever reason. In this case, he chose this panel. And he wouldn't trace it. He would do his own drawing based on it. People think, oh, he just mechanically, robotically traced comic book panels. And then by painting them as giant canvases that would end up looking like this, with the graphic representation of the comic book printing style using the enlarged Ben-Day dots, changing the lettering, putting it in his own style, you can see that it bears some resemblance to the original. But again, the context change, bringing it into a giant painting for gallery or museum display, is also what made what Lichtenstein doing art. Well, JOHN ROMITA was one of those romance comics artists. There's a Romita cover. And here's a Romita panel that the artist David Barcelou, who runs a site called Deconstructing Roy Lichtenstein, in which he pairs all of Lichtenstein's artworks, his paintings, with the comic book panels that he was, quote, inspired by. Once again, here's a Lichtenstein colored pencil sketch that he would then blow up and silkscreen as a painting that would look like this. Look at how significant this Romita inspired image was, that it was used for a 1994 retrospective of Lichtenstein's work, and then merchandised and merchandised again. This is why in the middle of 1965, at the peak of Lichtenstein's and pop art's early popularity, Marvel Comics itself would rebrand itself for about 3 months as Pop Art Productions. And it was around this time that writer-editor Lee would recruit Romita to come over from DC Comics, forget doing romance comics, and join the surging, burgeoning Marvel Comics bandwagon. So right around the time Ditko left, Lee immediately gave Romita a try at Spider-Man by first putting him on Daredevil a few issues earlier than this, and then having Spider-Man guest star. So this is really Romita's first published Spider-Man work in May of 1966. And you can see the character's a little on the stiff side, especially when we had been used to the unique bending and twisting of Spider-Man's anatomy in the hands of the one and only Ditko. His first splash page with Spider-Man in a trademark Ditko-like stance interacting with Daredevil, and a year before, or 1964, I believe, classic Ditko, back view of Spider-Man torqued. Well, either way, starting right where Ditko left off, Romita had to fill some pretty big shoes, but it really kind of, I think, took everybody by surprise at how quickly Romita, largely through some pretty great covers, would end up making people kind of forget Ditko in a sense and immediately sign on to Romita's version. He began to reinterpret and rebrand his stamp on some of Ditko's, great villains. So there's Ditko's Lizard, and here's Romita's only 6 issues into his run with an equally great Spider-Man figure. Ditko's Kraven the Hunter from issue 15, and Ditko's issue 47. That cover is as iconic as anything Romita would do. Or, I mean, there's Ditko's Vulture from issue 2. And I mean, even down to the gray classic Marvel Comics City. That's just a brilliant cover by Romita. Even one of Ditko's signature images that I've chosen to represent Ditko leaving the character, Romita would end up putting his own stamp on what is still considered to this day perhaps the greatest Marvel Comics cover of Romita's of Spider-Man of all time. There's the black and white original art. Very simple image, but powerful. And, don't ever underestimate the power of whatever you want to call force lines. But there's the person who created the artwork actually holding it. Yes. That artwork's been reproduced as the cover of one of IDW's Artifact editions. These are facsimile reproductions, giant hardcovers of the black and white original art, as close to the way the original art actually looks. And if you've never seen these, I mean, I haven't really focused on Romita's interior works as much as I'm trying to tell the story a little quicker through covers. But suffice to say that these artist editions are a great way to see a lot of Romita's interior work on Spider-Man. Because again, it was really through his covers that Romita would come to own the character, to the point where we're having a discussion 50 years later about which Spider-Man is the more definitive one. Because plenty of people would say, they love Romita's version. Another great Vulture cover, issue 48, or this was, I think, yeah, this was his first. The reason why I'm showing you this one now is if you take this cover and you flip it over and you come in close on that Spider-Man pose, lo and behold, you get this image that whoever they hired to illustrate this comic book style double page comic book ad in the summer of 1967 for the debut of these new cartoons that would be coming out in the fall in September. And yes, it was everybody's wish fulfillment that we would get the Spider-Man cartoon. So I'm just going to show you the opening and the closing. The music is the same, but the graphics are different. So here, from the fall of 1967 on ABC Saturday morning television, Spider-Man.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong? Listen, bud, he's got radioactive blood. Can he swing from a thread? Take a look overhead. Hey there goes the Spider-Man. In the chill of night, at the scene of a crime, like a streak of light, he arrives just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Wealth and fame, he's ignored. Action is his reward to him. Life is a great big hang up. Wherever there's a hang up, you'll find the Spider-Man. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong? Listen, bud, he's got radioactive blood. Can he swing from a thread? Take a look overhead. Hey there goes the Spider-Man. In the chill of night, at the scene of a crime, like a streak of light, he arrives just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Wealth and fame, he's ignored. Action is his reward to him. Life is a great big hang up. Wherever there's a hang up, you'll find the Spider-Man.
Sharp eyes will notice in the cartoon, they did have this insert based on, of course, Ditko's classic design that I showed you earlier in this presentation. But the majority of the cartoon had a more of a Romita feel. That's why you saw this credit at the end for jazzy Johnny Romita. And that's why the look of the character was really more of Romita's look versus, of course, Steve Ditko's take on the character. Here's another iconic Ditko villain, Dr. Octopus. And then when Romita first drew him, and again, his version of Dr. Octopus, especially in that new green costume that he came up with, really became everybody's favorite. And you can see as we jump ahead to issue 113 in the 1970s that, you know, Romita was still doing iconic covers with Dr. Octopus. Now, this isn't the first time that you see Romita doing a comic cover that looked like a newspaper. How about a comic cover that looked like a painting? In fact, it is a painting, but it's not a comic, it's a magazine. This is in 1968 when Marvel first ventured into the black and white magazine world. I shouldn't say black and white, it's really black and white with gray tones. But this was a startling development, and for all fans of the Romita Spider-Man, it was a chance to see how his art looked in black and white with gray tones, as you can see better on this page. You can see that Romita did the line art for the ad to promote the magazine. But of course, as we come in tight on the figure, it's definitely Romita's take on the classic Ditko pinup, I believe from 1964. And Romita just put his take on it. The cover was given, or this figure was given to the painter, Harold Rosenbaum, I believe, who was a painter of men's magazine illustration type things that looked like this. So he took Romita's line art and basically turned it into this painting. And when the type was laid into it, we got this cover. Now, for most of us that were reading comics at the time, this was the first time we saw a superhero painted. Now, previous to this, 4 years earlier, the great James Bama gave us the paperback covers of Doc Savage with his almost photorealistic painting style of the Man of Bronze. And then in 1967, a year before the Spider-Man magazine, this paperback came out with this painting of the Avengers lineup at the time. And that painting is by the great American illustrator, Robert McGinnis. You might know his work more famously for many of the Bond films, like Thunderball in 1965. Now, this might look like McGinnis, but it's not. It's a 1968 paperback book painted by a guy named Mitch Hollick, or something like that. But again, this was still fresh when we then saw Romita's second cover, and this time it looks like it's fully Romita, both drawn and painted. This was later on in 1968. And I mean, this image is one of Romita's most iconic. It's the classic Ditko villain, the Green Goblin. And I mean, you know, Ditko had produced some iconic Spider-Man, Green Goblin images during his tenure on the strip, but Romita legitimately placed his hat in that particular ring. Now, unlike the previous magazine, which was black and white with gray tones, you can see that this one, Marvel wanted to experiment with a full color magazine. So we got this double page spread opening, and you can see by Romita. He was able years later to turn this painted version into line art when he did this version for a 1973 reprint annual. And then I'm not sure this is, you know, would this be what he used to make the painting from, or it's a new piece of art done for this artifact edition? But that just shows you how iconic this particular image is. And by the way, this came out in November of 1968, the same month that Romita drew the cover to this classic Spider-Man story, where Spider-Man finds out who his parents were. Remember, he was raised by Uncle Ben and Aunt May. And in fact, the same month, he also did this cover, his take on the Ditko villain Mysterio, all in November of 1968. And I think the very next issue, I know, there's Ditko's Mysterio, debuted in 1964. And another great Mysterio cover, great Romita image, classic Romita pose of Spider-Man. And it's images like this from January of '69, during the height of the counterculture anti-Vietnam War protests. Well, the beginning of them, the early beginnings in '67 and '68. There's Romita's pencil of that cover. But yes, this particular pose became an iconic Romita pose, as iconic as those Ditko poses that I was showing you. And art directors would use that pose when they would do stories in the late '60s about the success of primarily Marvel Comics. They were deemed hipper, and they would show panels like this by Romita from that Spider-Man story. And that's why Spider-Man became a darling of the counterculture. In the early '70s, Cream magazine got Romita to do this cover. And 1969, again, at the height of the counterculture, look at how they highlight this cover, which is actually a reconfiguration by Romita of this cover. Again, only 4 issues into his run on Spider-Man. Why is this issue particularly memorable? Well, let's go back a year or two when Ditko was doing the strip and pairing off Betty Brant and Liz Powell, I think her name was, Liz Allen, as paramours of Peter Parker, but very subtly introducing another girl, Mary Jane Watson. But Ditko originally keeps her face a secret and leaves soon after. And it falls in the hands of JOHN ROMITA in that issue of Spider-Man to finally reveal the mysterious Mary Jane Watson. And as we scroll down, face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot. Man, with this one panel alone, Mary Jane Watson would become one of JOHN ROMITA's greatest creations and greatest icons. Even if he didn't create the character, he created, yeah, well, this is her first visualization because Ditko never got the chance. And you can see over the years, over the decades, how Romita would continually return, not only to Spider-Man, but specifically to Mary Jane. When the Comics Journal honors him in 2003 with a special issue, there's Romita having Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy, of course, guide his hand. Look at how popular Mary Jane Watson was, to the point where Romita's got her on a split cover, quote unquote split. And then decades later, when they get married, Marvel brings back Romita for the special wedding issue. And by the way, in that very first appearance, you can see the big lettering next to it, the rhino on the rampage. This was the first of a couple of major Spider-Man villains that Romita would create post-Ditko. Some of them would become, you know, long-term successful characters like the Rhino. Everybody has a favorite. Some like the Shocker. But it was really his creation of the Kingpin that Romita would create a truly iconic Spider-Man character who's become one of Marvel Comics' greatest villains, along with Dr. Doom. Here's another Ditko creation from issue 8, Electro. Man, I wish when they did the movie, they would have done that costume. But finally, Romita got to do his take on Electro. It wasn't until issue 82. But for some reason, I don't know why, I haven't found out in my research, this cover was rejected. And Stan Lee got old standby Marie Severin to redraw the cover. And don't ask me what they didn't like about this one. But Romita kind of got the last laugh when, I think somewhere around 1973, 74, he got to get it finished and printed on this cover of the Marvel Tales, reprinting that story. In 1969, Marvel Mania was created, the kind of successor to the Merry Marvel Marching Society. They got Jack Kirby to do most of the original artwork to brand Marvel Mania. These are all Kirby drawings, even that version of Spider-Man, which is kind of funky. And there's a picture of our pal Jack Kirby at the time, 1969. One of the big selling points of Marvel Mania, remember I said they didn't offer posters back then? Well, these were the first great Marvel posters because they were all incredible poses. I don't know how Black Knight made it in there, but Kirby's Fantastic Four, Silver Surfer, and Thor were incredible. His Doctor Doom. And then the Hulk was by Herb Trimpe, but we found out later, based on a Kirby drawing. The Steranko Captain America was incredible. And then we had the Romita Spider-Man poster, which looked like this, which you can see he kind of reworked a little from maybe this figure from a couple years earlier. But it's really a reworking of this poster by Jack Kirby. He was supposed to do the Spider-Man poster, and it got rejected. I mean, here's a photograph of Kirby looking a little dejected at the poster that never was. You know, obviously they wanted the villains in there, not stock Kirby androids. But yeah, it ended up being a classic Romita poster. Romita got to redo other artists' great works over the years during his run on Spider-Man. He got to take this classic Ditko cover and put his own spin on it in the early 1970s. There's the black and white version. Speaking of black and white, in 1971, when Spider-Man hit issue 100, John Romita wasn't even drawing the comic book then. Gil Kane was. But they got Romita to do the cover. He penciled it, and then longtime Marvel inker Frank Giacoia inked it. And in color, it became one of the greatest, most iconic Spider-Man covers of all time. Again, it's another Romita take on the original Ditko image, and debate as you will. In 1973, they got Romita to do the cover of what is considered one of the single most memorable images in Spider-Man and Marvel Comics history, because someone close to Spider-Man on that Romita cover was going to die. Yeah, Gil Kane was drawing the comic at the time, but notice they got John Romita to do the inks, and that's what he would do during the 1970s as opposed to drawing full time. So yeah, they killed Gwen Stacy. The very next issue, they got Romita to do the cover again. And again, over the next couple of years, Romita would return every now and then and do covers that were memorable and that were also, once again, subtle remakes of classic Ditko Spider-Man images. I mean, even this iconic image, Romita got to do over a rough layout by Gil Kane. But when you see the original sketch, Romita really made it his own. But there it is. In the 70s, Romita would just continue to put his stamp on the character with iconic poses as the merchandising and branding and licensing of Marvel Comics expanded exponentially in the 70s. Whenever they needed Spider-Man, Romita was there doing the license branding artwork. Notice with Stan Lee at the top. Well, there he is with Stan Lee. circa 1976, when they embarked on the first Marvel Comics syndicated daily and Sunday newspaper strip on Spider-Man. Dailies and Sundays that look like this. Here's even a magazine feature about how Lee was working with writers like Jim Shooter, pictured there, who was probably ghosting the strip for Stan Lee. And there are some rare photos. That's Marie Severin down below coloring. And there's, of course, Romita inking. You can get collections of these strips in hardcover and softcover volumes that look like this. As the 70s went on and Romita was the de facto art director at Marvel Comics, doing all of their merchandising and branding artwork, and again, all of these iconic Spider-Man poses. There he is in the 70s with his office and desk at Marvel Comics, which he autobiographically drew himself in this iconic image representing pretty much everybody he drew during his Spider-Man run, his most memorable run. Black and white original. And yet again, another Romita artist edition from IDW. In the 21st century, every now and then, Romita will pop in for a Spider-Man poster or some kind of licensed branding opportunity. At the 50th anniversary of Marvel in 2011, they got JOHN ROMITA to do Spider-Man to represent Marvel Comics itself. And that's how iconic, Romita's Spider-Man became. Now, Ditko over the years has gotten his share of books, maybe not as prominent, like this recent. Of all the pinups Marvel did in the 60s, editor and designer Craig Yo chose this one to represent all of them. There are kind of vanity press trade paperbacks like this, print on demand, fan press things, soft cover paperbacks, 9 by 12, 8.5 by 11, that, for you Ditko Spider-Man completists, you kind of have to have. There have been books about Ditko that talk about the entirety of his career. This one came out, over 10 years ago, whereas this one came out just recently. And speaking of just recently, there was a major exhibition in Italy of Ditko's work just a few years ago with an enormous hardcover catalog. And it's really the most scholarly look at Ditko's career that's ever been done, almost maybe for any artist. When you look at these shots of the exhibit, this is how you do a comic art exhibit, with a combination of beautifully framed original art as well as giant blow-ups of the art itself, beautifully designed into the installation space. About 10 years ago, an anonymous donor gave all of the original art to the very first Origin of Spider-Man story to the Library of Congress. We don't know who that donor is. Of course, there's speculation. And then all of Ditko's and Lee's Spider-Man were collected in an omnibus edition in 2007. That's really doubles as an ottoman as well. But it's got every Spider-Man story by Ditko, all 38 issues, plus Amazing Fantasy 15, of course, and the 2 annuals as well. But I gotta say, I'm really humbled and proud to be a part of this amazing book because the editor, Corey Settlemeyer, hired me to write an essay about Spider-Man as a pop culture phenomenon. And I titled it, How Could a Teenager Be a Superhero? So in the end, how do we view the great Spider-Man debate, quote unquote, Ditko versus Romita? You know, in comic book history, we've seen this type of thing before, especially in the Silver Age. There was, oh, seem to have froze. Let's try something else. Here we go. There was Joe Kubert's Hawkman, a character shown here from the early 60s, but that he first drew when he was a teenager in the 40s. And he only drew 6 issues of Hawkman between 1961 and 62. And yet those 6 issues are forever measured against those that his peer at DC, Murphy Anderson, would draw between 1964 and 1968. And people are still debating who drew Hawkman, you know, quote, better, or who is your favorite. There's Conan the Barbarian, drawn for Marvel by Barry Smith, starting in 1970, but by 1973 had come into his own with his mature, filigreed style. But then after leaving in 1973, he was replaced on Conan by the great John Buscema, who would draw Conan for, you know, decades after Barry Smith's 3-year tenure. And yet fans are still debating who drew the better Conan. So that's why in the end, there's no such thing as who did it better, Steve Ditko or JOHN ROMITA. It really comes down to, just like all art does, to personal preference. And therefore, where do I stand on Ditko versus Romita? Well, all I'll say is it's the end for now. Thank you, everybody, for attending this webinar, one of my many comics history projects. If you go to my website, arlenschumer.com, you can click on the individual pages in yellow up above on the menu bar and get my various interests. My comic book history page links to my book, The Silver Age of Comic Art, which if you buy it through me, I'll sign it, sketching it for you. Here's a double page spread for my Ditko chapter. Remember that great image that I love so much from the autobiographical story? Well, you can see how I used it. And the top 3 panels that I showed in the beginning of the presentation, I took out the original dialogue and put Ditko talking about how he created those things. So you read my book like a giant comic book, but it's really an art book and a history book as well. Here's the spread that is about Ditko leaving. And by the way, I didn't really go into that Herald Tribune article, but the reason why it's infamous is, as I write here in the lower left, when Ditko left Marvel in 1966, rumors circulated as to why. Rumors still in circulation today, because Ditko has never revealed why he turned his back on 2 of the greatest characters in the history of comics. Remember, folks, I did this before 2015 when he did reveal why. But his abrupt departure did follow an article in the New York Herald Tribune in which Stanley said, "I don't plot Spider-Man anymore. Steve Ditko, the artist, has been doing the stories. I guess I'll leave him alone until sales start to slip. Since Spidey got so popular, Ditko thinks he's the genius of the world." And as for showing you the great Romita cover on the right, listen to what I say here. The unenviable task of following Ditko on Spider-Man fell to artist JOHN ROMITA. Ditko's unique stylization made the character one of the few in comic book history to be so intrinsically linked to its original artist, which played a large role in Spider-Man becoming, by the time Ditko left in 1966, the bona fide mascot of Marvel itself. But Romita rose to the challenge, making his Spider-Man, represented by the cover of issue 50, one of the greatest in the history of comics, emerged from Ditko's shadow even more successful, and in a brief time, the de facto corporate logo of Marvel Comics. And this perhaps is my most cherished possession. When I handed Ditko a hardcover copy of my Silver Age book in 2014 and received this letter in response. And if you know Steve Ditko's correspondence, you know that he rarely ever praised anything like this. So I can't think of any better endorsement, right, folks? Anyway, come join my Facebook groups on the Silver Age of comic book art, one on Jack Kirby, and one on my biggest influence, Neil Adams, in terms of how he influenced me as an illustrator, doing comic book art for advertising and editorial usage. And one of my specialties is maintaining the photographic look of the person while merging them with comic book art. I'm on the TeePublic site for merchandising of over 125 of my images, and every kind of knick-knack, gewgaw, and tchotchke you could think of. My own merchandise site, popcultureman.com, linked from my website, has posters only, beautifully printed though, of many of the images not available on my TeePublic site. My visual lectures, which is what I used to call what I did live before the pandemic shutdown, and my webinars. This page is linked to my YouTube channel, my Vimeo channels, where you can see videos of many of my previous live lectures and my most recent webinars. But ever since the pandemic shutdown, I've synced up with New York Adventure Club, doing webinars that you have to buy a ticket for, but buying a ticket, if you can't make it live, allows you access to the recording of the webinar for a week. So this Friday, in time for July 4th, I'll be doing the two best versions of Captain America ever done in the Silver Age, Jack Kirby's and then Jim Steranko's. And then next week, Wednesday, the 7th, I will be doing a brand new webinar on the woman I believe is the greatest photographer of the 20th century, the fascinating story of Vivian Maier. And if you don't know anything about Vivian Maier, Google her and then come to my webinar next week. And just go to nyadventureclub.com, very simple to remember, and you can get tickets for these things. Or on my events blog on my website, I always have the things I'm doing and all of the links you'll need. So once again, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this webinar, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye-bye. Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.